77 women had glided past him, and Minjae hadn't spared a single one a second glance. He stood within the sprawling, gold-leafed expanse of the celestial ballroom at the Grand Regency, a flute of vintage champagne in his hand, watching the world's most elite models move like they were auditioning for a role they hadn't yet been cast in. Their designer silk gowns caught the harsh glint of crystal chandeliers that likely cost more than the average New York apartment. Their smiles were sharp, practiced, and as dangerous as a serrated blade. Every tilt of a head and every flutter of an eyelash was a calculation, a desperate attempt to catch the gaze of the man at the center of the room. And Minjae felt absolutely nothing. This masquerade of a charity gala was ostensibly for the city's pediatric wings, but the vultures in attendance knew the truth. They were here to climb, to network, and to secure a seat at a table built on blood and old money. For the women surrounding him, landing a man like Minjae was the ultimate prize. At 28, he was the undisputed heir to the Beck syndicate, a crime family whose reach extended from the darkest corners of the shipping docks to the gleaming glass towers of Manhattan real estate. Standing 6'2" in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that clung to his frame with lethal precision, Minjae was a study in contradictions. His dark hair was styled with clinical perfection, but the ink of a dragon's tail peeking out from beneath his white collar whispered of a life most of the guests couldn't fathom. His eyes, dark and heavy with the weight of seen violence, rarely looked soft. He possessed a face tailored for a magazine cover, yet he treated cameras with the same lethal caution one might show a loaded gun. 77 models had paraded through his line of sight tonight. His lieutenant, Eric, had been keeping a silent tally, occasionally nudging him when a particularly stunning woman paused nearby. Minjae simply sipped his champagne, feeling like an audience member at a play where he was the only one who hadn't been given a script. He had grown up in a world where beauty was a weapon used to distract or destroy. He knew that a pretty face was often the perfect mask for the ugliest of souls. He was already calculating his exit when the orchestra shifted into a haunting, slower tempo. The crowd parted near the edge of the bar, and that was when he saw her. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't wearing an emerald gown or a diamond necklace. She was a waitress in the standard black and white uniform of the hotel. She carried a tray of champagne flutes with a grace that felt entirely unmanufactured. Her dark skin glowed under the warm light of the chandeliers, and her natural hair was pulled back into a neat, low bun. Her expression was one of professional focus as she navigated the egos and the bodies filling the room. Minjae's eyes tracked her automatically, the way they tracked any anomaly in a pattern. He told himself it was just tactical awareness, the instinct that kept him alive in the Beck syndicate. But then, she stopped to deliver a drink and smiled at something a guest said. That smile hit him with the force of a physical blow to the sternum. It wasn't performed or calculated to manipulate a billionaire, it was 3 seconds of genuine, unvarnished warmth. Minjae forgot how to breathe. He stood frozen, his glass halfway to his lips, his entire world narrowing down to that single, devastating moment. Hey family, before the story begins, I want you to do something real quick. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your comments fuel these stories. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button because what happens next will leave you speechless. The sun rose over the East River with a cold, pale light that did nothing to warm the floor-to-ceiling windows of Minjae's penthouse. He hadn't slept. He stood by the glass, still wearing the trousers of his Tom Ford suit, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the dark, intricate ink that marked him as the heir to the Beck syndicate. In his mind, he was still in that ballroom, watching a single, unscripted smile cut through the darkness of his world like a flare. A discreet chime signaled the opening of his private elevator. Eric stepped out, looking as polished and clinical as he had at 2 in the morning. He didn't offer a greeting, he knew Minjae didn't want pleasantries. Instead, he walked to the heavy mahogany desk and placed a slim, silver tablet on the surface. He found her, Minjae thought, his heart rhythm shifting into a low, steady thrum. Eric cleared his throat, his voice professional and devoid of judgment. Her name is Esther Lawrence, he said. 24 years old. She's an honors graduate from NYU, currently working 2 jobs to support herself while she auditions for theater roles. She lives in a modest 2-bedroom in Bed-Stuy with 2 roommates. No criminal record. No ties to any of the rival families. She's clean, Minjae. Minjae sat behind the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. He picked up the tablet. The file was comprehensive: bank statements, social media history, even a grainy capture from a subway security camera. But it was the photograph at the top of the file that held him captive. It wasn't a professional headshot, it was a candid photo someone had taken of her at a park. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her dark skin luminous against the greenery. It was the antithesis of everything he knew. The 77 models from the night before were ghosts, manufactured entities designed to be consumed by men like him. They were beautiful, certainly, but they were hollow. Looking at Esther's file, Minjae realized she was the only real thing in a city built on illusions. She didn't have a tactical angle. She didn't have a hidden agenda or a price tag. Where is she now? Minjae asked, his voice a low rasp. She started her shift 10 minutes ago at a small cafe on Atlantic Avenue, Eric replied. She works the breakfast rush until 10. Minjae stood up, reaching for his jacket. He didn't care about the board meeting at 9 or the shipment coming into the docks at noon. For the first time in his 28 years, he wasn't acting as the heir to an empire. He was a man who had seen a light in the dark and found himself unable to turn away. Let's go, Minjae said, his eyes never leaving the image of her smile. I want to see if the coffee is as real as she is. The air inside the Atlantic Avenue cafe smelled of burnt espresso and rain-slicked pavement. At 6:01 a.m., the shop was a sanctuary for the early shift laborers and the insomniacs of Brooklyn. Esther moved behind the counter with a rhythmic, practiced ease, her hands moving from the steam wand to the pastry case without a wasted second. She was exhausted, the memories of the glittering gala from the night before still clung to her like a heavy fog, but there was a quiet dignity in the morning grind that she preferred over the gilded pretension of Manhattan. Then the bell above the door chimed, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It wasn't just the sound, it was the way the air seemed to grow heavy, as if someone had sucked the oxygen out of the small space. Esther didn't look up immediately as she reached for a paper cup. Morning, I'll be with you in just a second. The words died in her throat as her eyes landed on the man standing by the register. It was him. The man from the ballroom who had looked through her as if she were a ghost, then stared as if she were a miracle. He looked entirely out of place against the chipped laminate counters and the chalkboard menu. He had changed into a fresh white shirt, but the dark charcoal suit jacket was clearly bespoke, and the way he held himself, shoulders square, eyes scanning the room with a predator's clinical efficiency, screamed of a world that didn't belong in a neighborhood coffee shop. The ink of the dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse in the dim morning light. Black coffee, he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in her chest. Esther gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. She forced a professional mask into place, though her heart had begun to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. You're the man from the Grand Regency. The one who stood in the middle of 77 models and looked like he was at a funeral. Minjae didn't flinch. He didn't offer a charming billionaire smile or a suave excuse. He simply watched her with an intensity that felt like a physical weight, his dark eyes unreadable but focused. I was, he admitted. "This is Brooklyn, not a charity gala," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to sound tough. She leaned over the counter, lowering her voice so the construction worker at the corner table wouldn't hear. "Coming here, finding out where I work, that's usually called stalking, Mr. Whatever your name is." Minjae leaned forward, just an inch, bringing the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold winter air closer to her. "My name is Han Minjae. And I didn't come here to stalk you, Esther Lawrence. I came here to see if that smile from last night was a performance." Esther felt a flush creep up her neck. Her heart was racing now, not just from the shock, but from the sheer, magnetic gravity of him. He was dangerous, she could sense the history of violence humming beneath his polished exterior, yet he was looking at her as if she were the only real, solid thing in a city built on illusions. "It's a coffee shop," she whispered, turning toward the machine to hide the way her hands were shaking. "Everyone smiles for a tip." "Not like that," Minjae said softly to her back. "Never like that." They ended up in a narrow, dimly lit Thai restaurant tucked away on a side street in Queens, far from the prying lenses of the Manhattan paparazzi and the watchful eyes of the Beck Syndicate's lower soldiers. The air was thick with the scent of lemongrass, spicy basil, and the low hum of a radio playing music Minjae didn't recognize. For 3 hours, the world outside, the billion-dollar deals, the blood-stained docks, and the 77 models who had tried to claim his attention, simply ceased to exist. Esther found herself talking in a way she hadn't to anyone in years. Perhaps it was the way Minjae listened, his dark eyes never leaving her face, his presence like a silent, grounding anchor. She told him about the auditions that led nowhere, the electric thrill of standing under a stage light, and the way she felt when she stepped into a character. To her, acting wasn't about fame or the red carpets Minjae frequented, it was about the truth of the human experience, the ability to feel everything all at once. When she spoke about the theater, her face transformed, her eyes lighting up with a fire that made the restaurant's flickering candles look dull by comparison. Minjae watched the play of emotions across her features, mesmerized by the sheer, unbridled life in her. He had spent his entire existence surrounded by people who were either terrified of him or wanted to use him. Everyone he knew was a master of the mask. "What about you?" Esther asked, leaning over her bowl of pad CEW, her guard finally beginning to slip. "When you're not standing in ballrooms looking like you're ready to start a war, what do you do? What makes you feel that?" She gestured to the invisible space between them, the passion she had just described. Minjae remained silent for a long moment, his thumb tracing the rim of his teacup. The honesty in her gaze demanded something he wasn't sure he knew how to give. "In my world," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, "feeling things is a liability. You learn to shut it off before you're old enough to drive. You learn that softness is just a target for someone else's bullet." He looked up, and for the first time, the cold authority in his eyes was replaced by a hollow, aching exhaustion. "I spend every day making moves on a chessboard that never ends. Most days, I feel half dead, Esther. Like I'm just a ghost inhabiting a suit, waiting for the moment someone finally decides I've lived too long." The admission hung in the air, heavy and raw. He expected her to flinch or to look away in pity. Instead, Esther reached across the table, her fingers briefly brushing the back of his hand. The touch was light, but to Minjae, it felt like a jolt of electricity to a stalled heart. "Then let's find something that makes you feel alive," she whispered. "Because you're too real to be a ghost." The boxing gym was tucked into a basement in a forgotten corner of Queens, where the air was thick with the scent of old leather, liniment, and the rhythmic, hollow thud of gloves hitting heavy bags. It was a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of the Grand Regency, yet as Minjae led Esther down the concrete stairs, he seemed to walk with a lighter stride. Here, the walls were peeling and the fluorescent lights hummed with a low, nervous energy, but the teenage boys training in the ring looked at Minjae not with fear, but with a guarded, profound respect. Minjae leaned against a rusted pillar, watching a young boy work on his footwork. He explained softly that he funded the place, not for tax breaks or public relations, but because the streets outside were hungry, and these kids needed a fortress. Esther watched him, seeing the way he corrected a boy's stance with a gentle firmness. The shadow she had met at the gala was receding, replaced by a man who seemed to be trying to pay a debt he could never fully settle. "Why did you bring me here, Minjae?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of skipping ropes hitting the floor. Minjae turned to her, his expression tightening. The moment of peace was over. The truth was a weight he could no longer carry alone if he wanted to keep seeing her. "I told you I was a ghost inhabiting a suit," he said, stepping closer until the heat from his body shielded her from the gym's chill. "But I didn't tell you why. My family, the Beck Syndicate, we aren't just businessmen. We are the reason mothers in this neighborhood lock their doors at night. I am the heir to an empire built on fear, Esther. The coffee, the Thai food, this gym, it doesn't change the fact that my hands are stained with things you shouldn't even have to imagine." He braced himself for her to recoil, to run back up those concrete stairs and never look back. He expected the same judgment he saw in his own mirror every morning. Instead, Esther's face went pale, her eyes shimmering with a sudden, sharp clarity. She didn't move away. Instead, she looked at the boxing ring, but she wasn't seeing the fighters. "My brother," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Marcus. He was 19. He wasn't in a gang, he didn't sell anything, he was just walking home from a rehearsal." She finally looked at Minjae, and the pain in her gaze was more devastating than any physical blow he had ever taken. He was caught in a crossfire between two crews fighting over a corner they didn't even own. I spent 3 nights in a hospital waiting room only to bring him home in a box. She took a shaky breath, her gaze searching Minjae's as if looking for the monster he claimed to be. "I hate your world, Minjae. I hate everything it stands for. So tell me, why is the man who runs it the only person who has made me feel safe in years?" Minjae had no answer. He only knew that they were now 2 people standing in the wreckage of the same war, and for the first time, the silence between them felt like a prayer. The office of Han Dae-young sat at the very top of the Beck Tower, a space of cold marble and suffocating silence that felt more like a mausoleum than a place of business. The elder Han did not look like a monster. He looked like a statesman, silver-haired and impeccably groomed, sitting behind a desk of obsidian. But as Minjae entered the room, he felt the familiar, icy weight of his father's gaze, a look that had dismantled men far more powerful than a waitress from Brooklyn. Without a word, Dae-young turned a computer monitor toward his son. The screen flickered with grainy, high-angle surveillance footage. It was the cafe on Atlantic Avenue. The camera captured Minjae leaning over the counter, his usual predatory stillness replaced by a leaning, vulnerable intensity as he spoke to Esther. The next clip showed them in the dimly lit Thai restaurant, their hands nearly touching on the table. "A waitress, Minjae?" Dae-young's voice was a low, cultured rasp, like dry leaves skittering over a grave. 77 of the most influential families in the world sent their daughters to that gala for you. Any one of them would have brought an alliance, a port, a political seat. Instead, you spent your morning in a burrow that smells of failure, chasing a girl who serves coffee. "She isn't a distraction, father," Minjae said, his voice level, though the muscles in his jaw were locked tight. "She's a reminder that there is a world outside of this tower that isn't built on fear." Dae-young stood up slowly, his shadow stretching long across the marble floor. He walked to the window, looking out over the city he treated like a private hunting ground. You are the heir to the Beck syndicate. You do not have the luxury of a world without fear. That girl, she is a crack in your armor. And in our world, a crack is where the blade enters. He turned back, his eyes as hard and unreflective as the obsidian desk. You think you are protecting her by visiting her in the daylight? You are marking her. You are putting a target on a back that was never meant to carry one. She is a civilian, a nobody. And she is making you weak. I am not weak, Minjae countered, stepping into his father's space. Then prove it, the old man whispered. Cut this thread before I am forced to burn the whole cloth. A man in your position cannot afford to love anything he isn't prepared to see die. As Minjae left the office, he saw his father's second-in-command, a man with eyes like a shark, waiting in the hall with a folder in his hand. Minjae knew that folder contained Esther's home address, her roommates' names, and her brother's medical records. The clock had started, and the shadow of the Beck family was already reaching for the only light he had ever found. The rain began as a drizzle and turned into a downpour that mirrored the cold dread pooling in Esther's stomach. She was walking home from an evening rehearsal when she saw them, two black SUVs idling at the curb outside her apartment building. Four men stood on the sidewalk, their silhouettes sharp and immovable against the brick. They didn't look like muggers, they looked like corporate executioners in wool coats. As she approached, the lead man, a shark-eyed shadow Minjae's father had called his second-in-command, stepped forward. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. He simply held up a phone. The screen showed a live feed of her mother's house in Philadelphia. A similar black car was parked in the driveway. Mr. Han sends his regards, the man said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. He thinks you're a lovely girl, Esther. But he also thinks the world is a dangerous place for people who don't know their place. Especially for mothers living alone. Or roommates who walk home late at night. The air left Esther's lungs. She looked at the image of her mother's porch, the same porch where she used to wait for Marcus. The threat was unspoken but absolute. Minjae had warned her his world was built on fear, but she hadn't realized until this moment that his world now owned her life. What do I have to do? She whispered, her voice trembling. You have to be the one to end it, the man replied. If he thinks we forced you, he'll burn the city down to find you. You need to make him believe you never want to see him again. Do it now. He handed her her own phone. Her fingers were so numb she could barely swipe the screen. She dialed Minjae's private number. He picked up on the first ring. Esther? I was just about to. Don't, she interrupted, her voice hard and brittle. She looked at the shark-eyed man, who nodded once. Minjae, don't come to the cafe. Don't call me. I can't do this anymore. There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end. Esther, what's happened? If my father... Your father has nothing to do with me being smart for once, she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears mixing with the cold rain on her cheeks. I looked at you today, Minjae, and all I saw was the man who runs the world that killed my brother. Every time you touch me, I feel like a traitor. You're a ghost, remember? And I want to live in the light. Please, just stay in your tower and leave me alone. Esther, wait. She hung up before the sob could break through her throat. She stared at the blank screen, knowing she had just saved his life by destroying her own. The men in suits didn't say a word as they climbed back into their vehicles and melted into the New York traffic, leaving her standing alone in the rain, clutching a phone that would never ring with his voice again. The silence in the penthouse was shattered not by a bullet, but by a phone call. Han Dae-young, the man who had ruled the city with an iron fist for 30 years, had collapsed in his study. The dragon of the Beck syndicate had been felled by a stroke, his body betraying him even as his mind clung to the wreckage of his empire. When Minjae arrived at the hospital, the halls were already lined with men in suits, their faces masks of uncertainty. They were looking for a leader, and they were looking at him. Minjae stood over his father's bed, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of a ventilator. The man who had threatened Esther, the man who had turned beauty into a weapon and love into a weakness, was now nothing more than a frail shadow under white sheets. In that sterile room, Minjae realized the choice was no longer between his heart and his crown. It was about what kind of king he was going to be. He stepped out into the hallway, his expression colder and more resolute than it had ever been. Eric was waiting for him, his eyes questioning. "The captains are waiting for a statement," Eric whispered. "They want to know if we retaliate against the rival families. They want to know the strategy." "The strategy has changed," Minjae said, his voice echoing with a new, terrifying authority. "Assemble the board. Every captain, every lieutenant. We meet at the docks tonight." The meeting was not a strategy session, it was a massacre of tradition. Under the flickering lights of a shipping warehouse, Minjae stood before the men who had built the syndicate on blood and extortion. He didn't use a gun. He used a ledger. He systematically identified the branches of the business that dealt in the dark, the drugs, the street-level violence, the human cost. "These operations end tonight," Minjae declared, his gaze cutting through the room like a blade. "We are liquidating the assets. We are moving into legitimate shipping, infrastructure, and real estate. Anyone who wants to keep playing soldier can leave now. Anyone who tries to keep the old ways alive after tonight will be dealt with by me personally." There was a murmur of dissent, a hand reaching for a holster, but Eric and a dozen loyalists moved first. The purge was swift and clinical. By dawn, the Sun Syndicate as the world knew it was dead. In its place was a corporate entity with clean hands and a mountain of debt to pay back to the city it had bruised for decades. Minjae stood on the edge of the pier as the sun began to rise, the same cold light he had seen in his penthouse months ago. He had finally taken the throne, but the seat was empty. He had the power, but he was still looking for the light he had lost in the rain. "Is she safe?" he asked Eric, without turning around. "She's safe," Eric replied. "But she still thinks you're the man your father was." "Then I have work to do," Minjae said. 6 months is a long time to live in the shadows of a promise you aren't sure was kept. For Esther, the half-year since that rainy night had been a blur of auditions and long shifts, but the weight of the silence from Minjae's world had been the heaviest part of her days. She had watched the news, of course. She had seen the headlines about the restructuring of the Beck Corporation, the sudden philanthropic surges, and the quiet disappearance of the names that used to make the city tremble. But headlines were just paper, she needed to see the truth for herself. The basement gym in Queens was exactly as she remembered it, yet entirely different. The smell of sweat and leather was the same, but the desperate, jagged edge of the atmosphere had smoothed into something more disciplined, more hopeful. The boys training in the ring were focused, their gear new, and the trainers weren't the hardened street soldiers she remembered. She stood in the shadows of the concrete doorway, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Then she saw him. Minjae was by the heavy bags, coaching a teenager on his jab. He wasn't wearing a Tom Ford suit or a charcoal jacket. He was in a simple black t-shirt and athletic pants, his tattoos fully visible on his arms, no longer hidden weapons of intimidation, but marks of a history he had survived. His face, once so cold and unreadable, carried a weary peace she hadn't seen in the ballroom or the Thai restaurant. He looked like a man who had finally stepped out of a grave and decided to start walking. He must have felt the shift in the air, that tactical awareness he once called an instinct for survival. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the room until it locked onto her. The gym seemed to go silent. The thud of the bags and the squeak of sneakers faded into a dull hum. Minjae stood frozen, a boxing wrap still dangling from his hand. For a moment, he looked like he might be seeing another ghost, a remnant of the life he had fought to transform. Esther, he whispered, the name carrying the weight of 6 months of longing. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes scanning his face, looking for the monster and finding only the man. I saw the news, she said, her voice trembling but clear. They say the syndicate is gone. They say you're building community centers instead of fortresses. Minjae walked toward her, stopping just outside her personal space, respecting the distance she had once demanded. I told you I was half dead, Esther, he said softly. But I realized I didn't want to die. I wanted to be someone you didn't have to be a traitor to love. Esther looked around at the gym, at the kids who finally had a future, and then back at the man who had torn down an empire just to be worthy of a 3-second smile. For the first time in 6 months, she let her breath out in a long, shaky sigh. You kept your word. I did, Minjae said, his dark eyes shimmering with a light that was finally, truly real. And I never stopped waiting at this door. The transformation of the Queen's basement gym was complete, yet it remained tethered to the roots of their story. The smell of old leather was masked by the scent of 1,000 white lilies, and the harsh fluorescent humming had been replaced by the soft, warm glow of strings of Edison bulbs draped across the ceiling. There were no cameras, no socialites, and no calculated smiles. In the center of the room, where the boxing ring usually stood, a simple wooden platform had been raised. Minjae stood on that platform, adjusting the cuff of a suit that cost more than the gym itself, yet he had never felt more at home. When the music shifted, not to a grand orchestral movement, but to a soulful, acoustic melody, the heavy metal doors at the top of the stairs creaked open. Esther appeared, and for the second time in his life, Minjae forgot how to breathe. She wore a gown of simple, flowing cream silk that complemented the deep radiance of her skin. She didn't walk like a model on a runway, she walked with the grace of a woman who knew exactly who she was and exactly where she was going. As she reached the platform and took his hands, the scar on Minjae's eyebrow crinkled as he finally, truly smiled. When it came time for the vows, Minjae didn't look at the officiant. He looked only at Esther, his voice steady and grounding in the quiet space. I spent 28 years surrounded by people who used beauty as a mask and power as a cage, he said, his fingers tightening gently around hers. I thought I was destined to be a ghost in a world of shadows. But then you passed me by, and you didn't even try to see me, and that was the first time I felt visible. You gave me a reason to tear down a throne and build something worth living for. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a private, sacred whisper. I spent my life making people look over their shoulders in fear. I vow to spend the rest of it making sure you never have to look over yours again. My strength is your shield, and my heart is your home. I will spend every day of our lives making sure that the smile I saw that night never fades. Esther's eyes shimmered with tears that didn't fall. You already saved me, Minjae, she whispered. You just had to save yourself first. As they were pronounced husband and wife, a roar of genuine cheers erupted from the small crowd of neighborhood kids, gym trainers, and the few loyal friends who had seen the transition from syndicate to sanctuary. Minjae pulled Esther into a kiss that tasted of victory and peace. Somewhere in a Manhattan ballroom, another gala was likely beginning. Models were likely gliding past billionaires, and calculations were being made in the dark. But in a basement in Queens, a man who had walked past 77 versions of perfection had finally found something real. He had found the smile that saved him, and for the first time in his life, the heir to the shadow was standing fully in the light. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye.